The scent of failure was a complex perfume. It was composed of the sharp, acidic tang of fear sweating from the pores of men in $3,000 suits. It was the stale, recycled air of a boardroom that had been sealed for 10 hours, thick with exhaled carbon dioxide and dead hope. And underneath it all, a faint, almost imperceptible note of burnt sugar, the lingering ghost of the morning's untouched pastries, a sweet promise that had long since curdled. Julian Croft breathed it all in. The air was as heavy and expensive as the silence that filled the space between his lieutenants. He sat at the head of a vast, polished mahogany table. The wood was dark and cool, a solid sea of despair. Its surface reflected the grim, distorted faces of his team. Lawyers, accountants, strategists. The best minds money could buy. And they were all useless. Utterly, completely, and ruinously useless. Before him lay a document. A sheaf of papers 2 inches thick, bound in a funereal blue cover. The title was printed in stark, unforgiving letters, Asset Liquidation and Restructuring Agreement. A $50 million suicide note. His suicide note. He hadn't written it, but they were all expecting him to sign it. The clock on the wall, a minimalist monstrosity of steel and glass, showed 1:47 p.m. The signing was scheduled for 2 p.m. In 13 minutes, he was expected to dismantle an empire he had built from nothing. He was expected to hand the keys to his kingdom to vultures who would pick its bones clean. All because of a single, catastrophic miscalculation in a derivatives market he had been assured was a fortress. The fortress had crumbled, and he was buried in the rubble. "There are no other options, Julian," Marcus Thorne said, his voice a smooth, reasonable poison. Marcus was his chief financial officer, the men who had been at his side for a decade. The men who had steered the ship directly onto the rocks. "This is the only viable path. It contains the bleeding. We survive to fight another day." Julian looked at Marcus. He saw the perfect suit, the perfect hair, the perfectly feigned sympathy. He saw a man who would land on his feet, golden parachute already deployed. He didn't see a man who was losing everything. He saw a man who was simply managing a client's unfortunate downturn. The distance between them had never felt so vast. He didn't yell. He didn't throw the heavy crystal glass of water across the room. He had learned long ago that displays of power were for those who lacked it. His power had always been in his stillness, in the cold, quiet weight of his decisions. But now, there was only one decision left, and it felt like an execution. He let his gaze drift past the anxious faces, past the rows of useless experts, to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. His city. Or, what had been his city. From this height, the people below were ants, their concerns microscopic. Today, he felt smaller than any of them. And that's when he saw her. A ghost. A flicker of movement in the periphery, just outside the glass walls of the boardroom. A woman in a dull gray uniform, pushing a cart that squeaked with a rhythm of tired resignation. The cleaner. Ilara felt the squeak of the front left wheel of her cart in her teeth. It was a high, grating sound that vibrated up the metal handle and into her bones. Everything in her life felt like that squeak. A constant, irritating reminder of things being broken, off-kilter, and just barely functional. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the geometric patterns of the marble floor. The world of Croft Enterprises was a world of lines and grids. The tiles, the window frames, the ceiling panels, the precise alignment of the ficus trees in their brushed steel pots. She found a strange, hollow comfort in it. Her job was to maintain those lines, to erase the smudges and scuffs that marred their perfection. It was a job that made sense. You saw dirt. You cleaned it. The result was immediate and absolute. Her own life was not so simple. Her life was a chaotic mess of overlapping bills, threatening pink notices, and the ever-present, crushing weight of her sister's illness. $78,450. The number was branded into the back of her mind. It wasn't a vague, terrifying sum. It was specific. The cost of the experimental treatment, the travel, the post-operative care. A number she recited to herself every night, a monstrous prayer. She emptied the small trash bin from the executive reception area. Mostly paper, the crisp, expensive kind that rasped against her fingers. She didn't look at the people in the glass-walled boardroom. It was an unspoken rule. You were invisible. You were part of the building's machinery, like the air conditioning or the elevators. You did your job quietly, efficiently, and you did not exist. Looking at them, making eye contact, was a breach of protocol. It made them uncomfortable, forced them to acknowledge the existence of a world where people pushed squeaking carts for a living. So she didn't look. She focused on the floor. Her hands, chapped and red from chemicals, moved with an economy born of 1,000 identical shifts. The smell of industrial ammonia and cheap bleach clung to her uniform, a scent that was the polar opposite of the expensive, subtle colognes that haunted these halls. The cart squeaked past the boardroom. Squeak. 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 A metronome counting down the seconds of her shift. Only 3 more hours. 3 more hours, and she would have earned another $94.12, before taxes. A drop in the $78,450 ocean. She paused at the end of the hall, near the bank of elevators, to wipe down the stainless steel panel. Her reflection was a pale, tired smudge. The elegance of her mind, the poverty of her shoes. The thought came unbidden, a line from a book she had read late last night, the library book propped against her knees as she soaked her aching feet. She had a degree in mathematics, a master she had finished with honors 6 years ago, before her mother got sick, before her sister got sick, before the world had collapsed into a series of low-wage jobs just to keep the lights on. Her expertise was now in the specific gravity of different types of grime. Her understanding of differential equations was now used to calculate the optimal trajectory of her spray bottle to cover the most surface area with the least amount of wasted fluid. She saw numbers everywhere. Not just in textbooks. In the patterns of the tiles. In the rhythm of the security guard's patrol. In the precise intervals of the blinking lights on the server racks in the IT department. The world, to Ilara, was a grand, complex, and often beautiful equation. And cleaning these silent, empty offices at night was the closest she could get to the quiet contemplation of a university library. It was her sanctuary. But today was different. The office was not empty. It was thrumming with a tense, panicked energy that felt like a discordant note in the building's usual symphony of quiet commerce. The men in the glass box were not working. They were waiting. Waiting for an execution. She finished polishing the elevator panel, erasing her own smudged reflection. She turned her cart around, the squeaking wheel announcing her retreat. Squeak. 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 Back down the hall, past the glass box of despair. This time, she chanced a glance. Not at the faces. Never at the faces. She looked at the table. At the documents. Her eyes, trained to find the slightest imperfection, the smallest deviation from a pattern, scanned the scene. And that's when she saw it. It was nothing, really. A stack of papers left askew on a credenza behind the main table. Not the main document, the big blue one. A secondary pile. An appendix, maybe. Or exhibits. Most of the pages were aligned in a neat stack. But 3 pages, separated by thick wads of other documents, were dog-eared. Not folded, but creased at the top right corner. A tiny, insignificant detail. But the creases weren't random. Her mind, an involuntary pattern-seeking machine, saw it instantly. The first crease was on a page near the top of the stack. The second was about 1/3 of the way down. The third was about 2/3 of the way down. The spacing was almost perfectly proportional. Page 7. Page 19. Page 42. She couldn't read the numbers, of course. But she could feel them. The rhythm. The sequence. It was like seeing a tiny, repeating stain on a vast, clean carpet. A single, identical flaw, appearing at regular intervals. Anyone else would have seen a messy pile of paper. Ilara saw a warning. She shook her head, forcing the thought away. It was not her business. Her business was the smudge on the glass door of the boardroom, a greasy fingerprint left by a panicked hand. She pulled a cloth and her spray bottle from the cart. She sprayed. She wiped. The smudge disappeared. If only life were so simple. Evelyn, Julian Croft's executive assistant for 25 years, sat at her desk just outside the boardroom. She was a woman who had achieved a state of perfect, serene calm in the eye of every corporate hurricane. She had seen deals rise and fall, seen executives come and go, seen grown men weep in the privacy of their offices. She was the keeper of secrets, the guardian of the schedule, and the only person in the building Julian Croft truly trusted. She had been watching Elara. Not with suspicion, but with a quiet, grandmotherly curiosity. She had seen the way the girl organized the magazines in the waiting area, not by title, but by the dominant color on their covers, creating a subtle, pleasing gradient. She had noticed how, when Elara wiped down the large world map in the lobby, she followed the lines of longitude, not latitude, a small, strange act of precision. And she had seen Elara's library books. They were never romance novels or thrillers. They were dense, academic texts. Quantum physics. Post-war European history. Advanced calculus. Evelyn had once seen a book on chaotic systems and fractals peeking out of the girl's tote bag and had almost commented on it, before thinking better of it. You didn't survive this long in her position by being nosy. Today, she saw something new. She saw Elara pause her cart and stare, not into the boardroom, but at the credenza against the back wall. Evelyn followed her gaze. It was just a stack of documents, part of the due diligence binders for the deal. A mess, really. Marcus's team was not known for its tidiness. Evelyn watched as Elara's brow furrowed for a fraction of a second. It was a look she had seen before, but not on the face of a cleaner. It was the look of a mathematician finding a flaw in a proof. A brief, intense flicker of cognitive dissonance. Then it was gone. Elara turned, sprayed the glass door, wiped it clean, and started to move on. The intercom on Evelyn's desk buzzed, a harsh, demanding sound. It was Marcus. Evelyn, get me another bottle of water. And tell catering to clear this junk away, he snapped, his voice tight with irritation. The last thing we need is the smell of stale croissants stinking up the place while we're signing away the company. Of course, Marcus, Evelyn said, her voice smooth as polished stone. She stood up, her joints protesting quietly. As she passed Elara, she paused. Don't mind him, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. The smaller the man, the louder he barks. Elara started, surprised to be spoken to. She looked up, her gray eyes wide. I didn't hear anything, she stammered, her gaze dropping back to the floor. Evelyn gave a small, sad smile. I know, she said, and continued on her way to the kitchenette. She knew a frightened animal when she saw one. And she knew that sometimes, the most important things were seen by the people no one ever bothered to look at. She made a mental note. The girl's name was Elara. Inside the boardroom, the tension was escalating. The clock now read 1:52 p.m. 8 minutes. Julian, we have to be realistic, Marcus pressed, leaning forward. His cufflinks, gold knots, flashed in the light. The buyers are on their way up. Any hesitation now will be seen as weakness. They could pull the offer, and then we're not looking at a $50 million loss. We're looking at total liquidation. Chapter 7. Nothing left. Julian didn't respond. He picked up the pen. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy and cold. A gift from his father on his college graduation. To build worlds, the inscription read. Now he was using it to sign one out of existence. He uncapped it. The small click was unnervingly loud in the silent room. He stared at the signature line on the last page. A small, black X followed by a dotted line. The end of the line. His line. His mind flashed back to the beginning. A cramped garage, the smell of solder and ozone. The thrill of the first working prototype. The sleepless nights fueled by cheap coffee and impossible dreams. Every step of the journey, every victory, every defeat, had led to this. A polished table. A $50 million haircut. A pen in his hand. He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't notice the commotion at the door until Marcus's voice cut through the haze, sharp and cruel. What in God's name do you think you're doing? Julian looked up. Standing in the doorway was the cleaner. Elara. She stood there, her cheap polyester uniform a stark contrast to the Italian wool and silk that filled the room. She held a damp, gray rag in one hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a terrifying intensity. She had decided she couldn't leave. The image of the repeating stain, the broken pattern, was seared into her mind. It was wrong. Fundamentally, mathematically, aesthetically wrong. And letting it go was like leaving a shard of glass on a playground. It was a failure of duty. Her duty, as she saw it, was to fix things that were broken. To clean up messes. And this was the biggest mess she had ever seen. She had tried to tell Evelyn. She had found the older woman in the kitchenette, her hands shaking slightly. The papers, Ilara had whispered, her voice hoarse. On the back table. They're wrong. Evelyn had looked at her, truly looked at her, and seen the desperate sincerity in her eyes. What's wrong with them? She had asked gently. The pattern, Ilara had said, struggling for words that would make sense. There's a pattern, and it's broken. It's a mistake. A deliberate mistake. It was the conviction in that last phrase that had decided it for Evelyn. She had put down the water bottle. Then you have to tell him, she had said, her voice firm. Now. And so, propelled by Evelyn's quiet certainty and her own screaming internal sense of order, Ilara had walked back to the boardroom. She hadn't knocked. She had just pushed the heavy glass door open. Now, every eye in the room was on her. A dozen pairs of eyes, filled with confusion, irritation, and outright contempt. I said, "What are you doing?" Marcus repeated, his voice dangerously low. He stood up, placing himself between Ilara and Julian, a human shield of arrogance. "This is a private meeting. Get out. Now." Ilara's throat was dry. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. All her instincts screamed at her to flee, to apologize, to become invisible again. But the image of her sister's pale face, the quiet hum of the hospital machines, the $78,450, held her in place. This was more than just a broken pattern. It was a chance. A terrifying, infinitesimal chance. "It's wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's wrong?" Marcus sneered, taking a step toward her. "Your paycheck. Believe me, if you interrupt Mr. Croft again, you won't have to worry about that." He looked around the room, a small, cruel smile on his lips, inviting the others to share in the joke. The humiliation. "Now get back to your mops and buckets where you belong." The words hit her like a physical blow. The heat rose in her cheeks. He was right. Who was she? A cleaner. A nobody. She looked past him, at the impassive face of Julian Croft. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said a word. He just watched, the pen still held loosely in his hand. She took a breath. The air tasted of ammonia and fear. "The contract," she said, her voice a little stronger this time. She pointed a trembling finger, not at the main document in front of Julian, but at the messy pile on the credenza. "There. It's wrong." Marcus laughed. A short, ugly, barking sound. "Oh, this is rich," he said, turning to Julian. "The cleaning lady has some thoughts on the merger agreement." "By all means, Julian, let's hold the signing. Let's hear her expert legal analysis. Perhaps she's noticed a misplaced comma." The other men in the room shuffled uncomfortably. A few chuckled nervously, looking to Marcus for their cue. This was it. The moment of retreat. The point where she was supposed to stammer an apology and disappear, her face burning with shame for the rest of her life. She could feel the familiar weight of invisibility settling back onto her shoulders. But then she saw it again in her mind's eye. The 3 dog-eared pages. The perfect, proportional spacing. A pattern. A signal. And she knew, with an absolute certainty that defied all logic and reason, that she was right. "It's not a comma," she said, and her voice was suddenly clear and steady. It cut through the tension in the room like a diamond cutter on glass. "It's a structured error in the valuation tables. It repeats. Page 7, Exhibit C, page 19, Exhibit H. And page 42, Exhibit M. The asset depreciation is calculated using a 5-year straight-line model, but on those 3 pages, and only those 3, it's been replaced with a 7-year double-declining balance. It inflates the residual value of the assets being transferred, but it deflates their actual book value in the summary sheets. It's a 3-card Monty, played with amortization schedules. Silence. A profound, deafening, absolute silence. The nervous chuckles died in the throats of the junior executives. The smug, cruel smile was frozen on Marcus Thorne's face, slowly melting into an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. Ilara hadn't looked at the documents up close. She hadn't needed to. She had spent years, a lifetime, seeing the world as a series of interconnected systems. Cleaning had only sharpened that skill. She knew that when you cleaned a massive office building, you didn't just clean room by room. You worked in systems. All the glass first. Then all the trash. Then all the floors. You looked for the repeating elements and addressed them systematically. And if you found an anomaly in one of your systems, a type of stain that didn't belong, a piece of trash that was out of place, you didn't ignore it. You investigated it. Because an anomaly was never just an anomaly. It was a symptom of a larger problem. The dog-eared pages were an anomaly. Her mind had simply filled in the blanks. The most likely reason for marking pages with that kind of rhythmic regularity in a financial document was a repeating clause or calculation. The most likely way to hide a significant financial discrepancy was to alter that repeating calculation in a way that was subtle but cumulative. The rest was just deduction, a logical leap made by a mind that lived and breathed patterns. Julian Croft slowly, deliberately, placed the pen on the table. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at his team of stunned, slack-jawed experts. He looked at Ilara. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. Not as a ghost, not as a uniform, but as a person. "Show me," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a request. It was a command. Marcus finally unfroze. He lunged, not physically, but verbally. "Julian, this is insane. It's a lucky guess. A parlor trick. We don't have time for this circus. The buyers are waiting." His voice was a little too high, a little too shrill. Panic was beginning to fray the edges of his perfect composure. Julian ignored him. His gaze was locked on Ilara. "Show me." Heart pounding, Ilara walked into the room. The men parted before her as if she were carrying a live grenade. She walked past the main table, straight to the credenza. Her hands, sure and steady now, went straight to the pile of documents. She didn't fumble. She didn't search. She slipped her fingers into the stack and pulled out the 3 dog-eared pages with surgical precision. She walked back to the main table and laid them out, side by side, in front of Julian Croft. She didn't lay them in the center of the table for everyone to see. She placed them directly in front of him, creating an intimate space in the midst of the chaos. "Here," she said, her finger tracing a line of dense, numerical data on the first page. "The asset is 3D printing machinery. Purchase price, $5 million. Depreciation, straight line, 5 years. $1 million per year." Her finger moved to the second page. "Here. Server farm. Purchase price, $10 million. Depreciation, straight line, 5 years. $2 million per year." She paused, then moved her finger to the final, damning line on each page. "The calculation is correct on the exhibit summary. But the number that gets carried over to the master asset ledger," she tapped a different column, "is from a different calculation. A hidden column in the source spreadsheet, I would guess. One that uses a 7-year double-declining model. It makes the assets look more valuable on paper than they actually are to you, but it transfers them to the buyer at a massively depreciated cost. They're not just buying your assets. You're paying them to take them." She looked up at him. "It's not a $50 million loss," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The way this is structured, with the tax implications and the write-downs on the other end, it's closer to $100 million. They're not just buying your company. They're stealing it." Julian stared at the pages. He didn't need to be a mathematician to understand. He had built his empire on an intuitive grasp of value. He saw it instantly. The sheer, elegant, brutal criminality of it. A poison pill, disguised as a lifeline. He leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. It was the only sound in the universe. He looked at the faces of his expert team. The head of his legal department was pale, his mouth slightly open. His top accountant was furiously punching numbers into his phone, his face a mask of dawning horror. They hadn't seen it. They had been looking for a forest fire and had missed the quiet, systemic rot in the trees. Then, he looked at Marcus Thorne. Marcus was no longer smiling. The mask was gone. All that was left was the raw, naked panic of a man who had just been caught. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly seemed too big for him. He was sweating now, the acidic scent of fear Elara had smelled earlier now emanating directly from him, a foul, overpowering cologne of guilt. It's a clerical error, Marcus stammered, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an ally, a lifeline. He found none. Every eye was on him, cold and accusatory. A mistake in the data entry. It's negligible. Negligible. Julian's voice was quiet. Terrifyingly quiet. A $50 million clerical error is negligible to you, Marcus. He picked up his phone from the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Evelyn, he said into the phone. Cancel my 2 p.m. meeting. Permanently. And tell security to come up to the main boardroom. They will be escorting Mr. Thorne from the building. He is not to be allowed back in. Ever. He is not to touch his computer. He is not to collect his personal belongings. He is to be walked to the curb and left there. He paused. And Evelyn, find out what bank holds the mortgage on his house in the Hamptons. I want to buy it. He disconnected the call and placed the phone back on the table with a soft click. Marcus Thorne looked like he had been shot. The color drained from his face, leaving a pasty, gray canvas of ruin. Julian, you can't, he whispered. 10 years. I've given you 10 years. And in 10 minutes, you tried to take everything, Julian replied, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Security will be here shortly. I suggest you wait for them quietly. He turned his back on Marcus, a final, absolute dismissal. The king was dead. A new order was being born. Julian turned his attention back to Elara. She was still standing by the table, the gray rag still clutched in her hand, a forgotten talisman. She looked like she wanted to evaporate. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her feeling exposed and terrified. She had just gotten a man fired. A powerful man. She had just saved another powerful man from ruin. She had no idea what was supposed to happen next. The 2 security guards who arrived were large, impassive men. They flanked a stunned and silent Marcus Thorne and led him from the room without a word. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing the tomb on a decade-long career. The remaining experts in the room started to babble, a frantic chorus of apologies, excuses, and belated analysis. I can't believe we missed it, the complexity of the nested clauses, we should have run a full forensic audit. Julian raised a hand. The babbling stopped instantly. All of you, out, he said, his voice still quiet, but now laced with a thread of steel. Go back to your offices. Review every single document this company has signed in the last 5 years. Every contract, every deal, every memo. I want to know where every single penny is. I want a full accounting of Marcus Thorne's entire tenure. Do not talk to anyone. Do not leave the building. Just work. Now. They scrambled to obey, gathering their papers, their laptops, their briefcases, their shattered professional pride. They avoided looking at Julian. And they gave Elara a wide, almost fearful berth, as if she were some sort of corporate oracle, a mysterious force they could not comprehend. Soon, the room was empty. Empty, except for Julian Croft, sitting at the head of his reclaimed kingdom, and Elara, the girl in the gray uniform who had just saved it. The silence that descended was different from the one before. It was not heavy with despair. It was light, clean, and filled with a terrifying, exhilarating potential. Julian finally looked at her. He studied her face, the smudge of dirt on her cheek she didn't know was there, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the chapped, raw hands that had just pointed out a $50 million fraud. What is your name? He asked. Elara, she said, her voice a whisper. Elara, he repeated, testing the sound of it. You have a degree, don't you? In mathematics. Or accounting, it wasn't a question. She nodded, surprised. Mathematics. A master's. And you work for the cleaning service, he stated. Yes. He gestured to the chair beside him. The one Marcus had just vacated. "Sit down, Ilara." She hesitated. Sitting at the table felt like a transgression far greater than anything she had done so far. But the look in his eyes told her it was not a suggestion. She slowly, hesitantly, pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat on the very edge of it, her back ramrod straight. She placed the damp rag on her lap, a strange offering at the altar of high finance. Julian leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped. He was no longer the defeated man from 20 minutes ago. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity that was almost frightening. He was a predator who had just been reminded of his own power. "How did you see it?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. "My team, a dozen of the highest-paid financial minds in the city, looked at this document for a week. They saw nothing. You looked at it for 30 seconds from 50 feet away." "How?" Ilara struggled to explain. How could she describe the way her mind worked? How could she explain that to her? Numbers had shapes, and equations had rhythms. I see patterns," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "In everything. The floor tiles, the way people walk, the numbers in a spreadsheet. It's all just information." And there was a break in the pattern. A mistake. It felt loud. "To me." He stared at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the first time she had seen him smile. It transformed his severe features, making him look younger, more human. "A loud mistake," he mused. "I've spent a fortune on software designed to find anomalies, on analysts trained to see what others miss. And all this time, the answer was a loud mistake." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. His city again. Marcus Thorne wasn't just incompetent, he said, his back to her. He was a traitor. This deal wasn't meant to save the company. It was meant to gut it and deliver the choicest parts to our biggest rival. He was being paid on both ends. I'm guessing the dog-eared pages were his signal to the buyer's legal team, a way of pointing out his handiwork without leaving a digital trail. He turned back to face her. "You didn't just save me $50 million, Ilara. You saved this entire company. You saved 1,000 jobs. You saved me." The weight of his words settled on her. It was too much. She shook her head. I saw a stain. I pointed it out." "You saw a stain that no one else could see," he corrected her. He walked back to the table, and for the first time, she noticed the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. The adrenaline of the confrontation was wearing off, leaving behind a profound weariness. "I owe you a debt," he said simply. "Name it. Anything. A number. Write it on a piece of paper. It's yours." Her mind instantly went to the number. The one that was always there, humming in the background of her life. $78,450. For a man who had just been saved from a $100 million disaster, it was nothing. A rounding error. She could ask for $1 million. $10 million. He would probably pay it without blinking. It would solve all her problems. Her sister's treatment. A new house. A new life. She would never have to smell bleach and ammonia again. But the words wouldn't come. The idea of taking that much money felt wrong. It felt like a transaction. A payment for a service rendered. And what had happened in this room felt like something more than that. It felt like a fundamental shift in her own personal universe. She took a deep breath. "I don't want your money," she said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. Julian looked genuinely shocked. He had offered fortunes to people before. No one had ever said no. "What?" "I mean," she stammered, trying to correct herself, "I do need money. But I don't want a reward." She looked at her hands, at the ragged cuticles and the red, chapped skin. "I want a job." She looked up and met his gaze, her own now as steady and intense as his. "I want a desk. And a computer. And access to your files. You said it yourself, your company has been rotting from the inside. Marcus Thorne was a symptom, not the disease. You have more loud mistakes in your books. I can feel it. I can find them." She leaned forward, Her earlier timidity completely gone, replaced by the passion of a mathematician who has just been handed the most complex, beautiful problem she has ever seen. Don't give me a fish, Mr. Croft. Give me a fishing pole. Let me work for you. Let me find the stains. Julian Croft was speechless. He had been prepared to write a check, to solve her problem with the blunt instrument of his wealth. He had expected gratitude, tears, maybe even a request for a life-altering sum. He had not expected this. He had not expected a demand for a purpose. He had not expected a partner. He started to laugh. It was not a polite, corporate laugh. It was a deep, genuine, booming laugh that echoed in the empty boardroom. A laugh of surprise, and relief, and something that felt dangerously like hope. A fishing pole, he said, wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. God, I like you, Ilara. He sat back down, not in his chair at the head of the table, but in the one next to her, the one recently occupied by his now disgraced head of legal. He was no longer her superior. He was her collaborator. All right, Ilara, he said, his voice dropping back to that low, intimate tone. You've got a job. Your title is, whatever you want it to be. Your office is, whichever one you want. Your salary is, we'll get to that. But first, he slid a blank sheet of paper and his heavy Montblanc pen across the table to her. You said you need money. You may not want a reward, but I have a debt to pay. And I always pay my debts. So, write down the number. The real number. Not the one you think you should ask for, but the one you need. The one that keeps you up at night. Her hand trembled as she took the pen. It felt impossibly heavy, a scepter of some new, unfamiliar power. The paper was crisp and cool. She thought about her sister, about the doctors, about the hope that had been so faint for so long. She wrote down the number. $78,450. She pushed the paper back across the table to him. Julian looked down at the precise, neat handwriting. He looked at the modest, achingly specific number. He had been expecting 6 or 7 figures. This small, precise amount told him more about her character than any resume or interview ever could. It was not a number born of greed. It was a number born of desperation. A problem that needed a solution. He nodded slowly. This will be in your account by the end of the day, he said. Then he took the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. And your salary will be 10 times this. Per year. Starting today. Ilara's mind reeled. She tried to do the math. $784,500. The number was so large it didn't seem real. It was an abstract concept, a string of digits with no connection to her world of squeaking carts and $94 shifts. That's, she started, but she couldn't finish. The words wouldn't form. That's your starting offer, he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. We can negotiate up from there, once you've shown me what you can do. Consider this your new signing bonus, he stood up. Come on. I'll show you to your new office. I think the one next to mine just became available. 1 year later. The office was large, with a view that swallowed half of downtown. The desk was a clean, minimalist slab of white oak. On it sat a powerful computer with 3 monitors, displaying not spreadsheets or emails, but what looked like swirling, colored galaxies. They were visualizations of market data, custom-built by Ilara to represent financial systems as complex, interacting patterns. Ilara stood at the window, her back to the door. She was no longer wearing a gray polyester uniform. She wore a simple, elegant dark blue dress, the kind of quiet luxury that speaks of confidence, not of the need to impress. Her hair, once pulled back in a severe, functional bun, now fell softly to her shoulders. She was the same person, but the lines of exhaustion and fear had been erased from her face, replaced by a calm, focused intensity. The door opened and Julian Croft walked in. He didn't knock. He never did. He carried 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to her. Their fingers brushed. It was a small, familiar intimacy that had grown between them over the past year. Find something, he asked, standing beside her at the window. She pointed a single, manicured finger at the middle screen. A small, red flare had appeared in the heart of a swirling green nebula of data. There, she said. A new acquisition target. A biotech firm in Germany. Everyone is looking at their patent portfolio. That's the green, she gestured to the main body of the visualization. But no one is looking at their logistics and shipping subsidiary. It's losing a small amount of money. A rounding error. Everyone assumes it's just inefficiency. But it's not, Julian said. It wasn't a question. He had learned to trust her instincts implicitly. It's not, she confirmed. It's not a stain. It's a signature. The losses aren't random. They occur in a very specific, non-linear pattern, tied to the price of certain rare earth minerals. They're not losing money. They're stockpiling. Quietly. Off book. The company isn't the prize. The shipping subsidiary is. They found a way to corner the market on a key component for next-generation batteries. Julian looked from the screen to her face, a look of pure, unadulterated admiration in his eyes. In the past year, Ilara, his chief pattern officer, a title they had invented together, had saved or made the company over $200 million. She had found ghost accounts in their pension funds, identified a hedge fund's predatory trading algorithm by the rhythm of its trades, and predicted the collapse of a commodity supplier by noticing a sudden change in the font used on their invoices, a sign, she had correctly deduced, that their usual printer had cut them off for non-payment. She saw the things no one else did. She looked at the dirt, the smudges, the things everyone else was trained to ignore. And she had made them both obscenely wealthy in the process. So we buy the company, Julian said, and we spin off the biotech division to our competitors for a song. Let them fight over the patents. We keep the real prize for ourselves. Exactly, she said, taking a sip of her coffee. It was a dance they had perfected. He had the vision, the capital, the appetite for risk. She had the eyes to see the true path, to distinguish the signal from the noise. They were a two-person army, a perfect fusion of instinct and intellect. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was both proprietary and tender. Their relationship had evolved slowly, cautiously. It had started as a partnership, built on mutual respect and a shared intellectual fire. But in the quiet late-night hours, working side by side, it had deepened into something more. It was in the way he looked at her, the way he brought her coffee just the way she liked it, the way his hand sometimes lingered on the small of her back as they walked out of the office together. My sister called last night, Ilara said, changing the subject, her voice soft. She took her first steps without the walker. That's wonderful news, Julian said, his voice warm and genuine. She wants to meet you, Ilara said, looking down into her mug. She says she wants to thank the men who gave me a fishing pole. Julian smiled. I'll clear my schedule. On the corner of her massive, clean desk sat a single, small object that seemed out of place. It was a small, gray, worn-out cleaning rag, folded into a neat square and encased in a simple glass box, like a holy relic. Evelyn had given it to her on her first day in the new office. To remind you of where you came from, the older woman had said, and to remind them of what they almost lost. Ilara looked at the rag. It was a reminder of the invisibility, the weariness, the quiet desperation. But it was also a reminder of her strength. The strength to see what others missed. The strength to speak up when everything told her to be silent. The strength to clean up the messes of the world, one broken pattern at a time. Julian followed her gaze to the glass box. Still looking for stains, he asked softly. Ilara looked up from the relic of her past life to the man who was her present and her future. She looked at the city sprawling beneath them, a vast, complex equation waiting to be solved. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Always, she said. There's always another stain. And together, they turned back to the window, partners in a world they were rebuilding, one loud mistake, one broken pattern at a time. Their reflections looked back at them from the glass, a man who had almost lost everything, and the invisible woman who had taught him how to truly see. They were no longer just reflections, they were a single, unified image of power, purpose, and a future that was as clean and bright as a freshly polished window. The city hummed below, a symphony of chaos and order, and for the first time in a long time, both of them knew, with absolute certainty, that they were conducting it.